My name is Ondřej Dietrich. I'm the director of the Institute of International Relations, and I have the pleasure to welcome you to the first panel of this year's Schengen Security Forum on collection and usage of personal data. We live in a digital economy, and that means that every day and each one of us produce and share a vast amount of data. We co-produce our digital data doubles that occupy this new plane of digital politics. And these data are of value. They are used for a variety of purposes. They are used by public authorities to fight crime, more recently to manage, or at least attempt to do so, the COVID-19 pandemic. But they are also used by private entities to develop artificially enhanced choice architectures that steer us towards certain choices, certain preferences when we buy stuff online, or that impose certain barriers and steer us toward information that we use to make sense of our lives. They are also used to train these algorithmic machines to be more effective in what they do. And perhaps most ominously, they are used by authoritarian regimes to manage their populations. So this is the new plane of data politics that we, through our digital data doubles, we inhabit. And about how these personal data are used, how they are shared, and what are the challenges for human rights, for our liberties, our civil liberties. That's going to be the key question at our panel. And we are fortunate to have a great array of participants here. We will be hearing from Christina Erion, Associate Professor at the Institute for Information Law at the University of Amsterdam. Matthias Leese, Senior Researcher at the Center for Security Studies, CSS, at the ETH Zurich. And Edina Hill, former head of Google Hungary and Senior Advisor to Digital Transformation and Social Change Agent. I will ask our speakers today to provide their initial thoughts, to share their initial thoughts on the subject. We have quite a lot of time, so please feel free not to restrain yourself to some kind of very severely imposed limit when it comes to time. But of course, then we will be happy to hear also from the participants, from the public. Please feel free to use the Slido application, and I will be happy to pass your questions or comments to the speakers to facilitate the discussion. And also, please do not forget that both for the speakers and the audience, for all participants of this year's Schengen Security Forum, we are organizing an online networking session later today in the afternoon from 5 to 6 p.m. So with that, let me pass the floor, the very virtual floor, of course, to Christina. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ondřej. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, my fellow panelists. Hello there in cyberspace. I want to send my greetings to you from beautiful Amsterdam. However, I would have much more preferred to now be in Prague with you at the Czernin Palace. I was very much looking forward to this event, but of course it is quite sensible that we are now in not together, that we are trying to take precaution during the second winter of a pandemic. So nevertheless, now online, I have to really give my compliments to the organizers. Everything is super smooth. What a wonderful online event. And I'm going to now give you a short impression on the topic of the conference of the Schengen Security Forum, Digital Transformation in Europe after 2020, Adaptation in Cyberspace. Very fitting topic, and we have a lot that we can learn from these last 2 years and what we have made in terms of a transition. So let me get started. Digitalization and datafication in Europe have accelerated during the pandemic year. On the one hand, digital technologies have been tremendously helpful to cope with the real-world implications and repercussions of this public health crisis. Remote working and teaching have enabled us to carry on. Corona apps on smartphones are used across member states, and the digital technology sector has seen unprecedented growth. On the other hand, the events have laid bare dependencies of large parts of European public life on digital technologies for online teaching, meeting, and collaborating. When the demand surged, there has not been much time for public sector organizations, education and health institutions, among others, to carefully assess the privacy and data protection implications of these technologies for its users and associated personal data flows. Public procurement and provisioning has moved ahead without fully attuned to the public service mission of these organizations. They didn't carry out privacy impact assessments and oftentimes implicitly embraced data-driven business models that are not in the interest of some of its constituencies. I can attest to this as a university teacher. It was wonderful that we could continue teaching, but we had not the right tools directly at our hand. And we also had to wonder about whether the privacy settings of some of these services are actually in line with our mission as a public sector university, and whether we are protecting the privacy of our students adequately. We also embraced online proctoring, where students can take exams at home under a surveilled setting. We also embraced many, many other technological solutions in order to keep going. However, as it turns out on the way, not everything has been well negotiated. As business users of many of these digital services, of course, we already get a certain contractual treatment. However, even in these contractual treatments, our terms of service have not been fully aligned with what is legally required under the General Data Protection Regulation, a law here in the EU. Compliance, by example, when using digital technology that is provided by the private sector, is a primary obligation. We have a responsibility that flows from the rule of law in Europe and the special role of public sector institutions to actually lead by example. There are, of course, many new and noteworthy initiatives, best practices that underscore that it is possible, but Europe should really brace itself for being smarter when procuring digital technology that can affect citizens' fundamental rights. And one of the things that I mean here is that we do not understand as data protection scholars why every institution, every public sector organization has to reinvent the wheel again when procuring exactly the same type of software or cloud computing service or conferencing tool. In a way, what we are needing is also some sort of scalable recommendations that make it easier for public sector institutions to make such decisions. Because at the moment, everybody is doing it again and again. Authorities, data protection authorities in Sweden, in Italy, also in the Czech Republic, are giving now recommendations on the use of office productivity software, of online meetings and video conferencing tools. But why on earth do we have to do that everywhere again and again, given that we have the same legal framework that underpins it all? So I was hoping for more guidance, more streamlined advice, for example, using the collaboration mechanisms in the European Data Protection Board, so that in the end, it is possible for every public sector official or university administrator to actually procure tools and devices that are from the outset GDPR compliant. And this is not difficult, and this is not something where we have to be afraid of procuring private sector technology, but we have to be able to do it better and more smarter, and to reuse our energies in a better way. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this appeal. I mean, I can testify on my part that here in the Czech Republic, in our education institutions, of course, I mean, we faced new challenges related to GDPR, since we wanted to maintain contact with our students and continue to educate. And what you say, of course, makes perfect sense. I'm just thinking, you know, we are not only dealing with public actors of the government kind. You know, my institute, universities here in Prague, I mean, they may be public institutions, but they are not parts of the government. So how do you make them share information well? Which is, I think, what you suggest, that this should have been done better, that the best practices should have been shared better. Is there some kind of mechanism, some way, some sort of practical recommendation that you would have, you know, that would push us at least a little bit toward this goal or in this direction?
Well, thank you for this good question. I actually believe that in the Netherlands we have some examples how it was done well. For example, that data protection impact assessments, these are rather large and rather technical documents that are trying to assess if a particular private service corresponds with the requirements of the law, that they should be public instead of always being buried within organizations, because otherwise we are gonna redo them at different places again and again. So one of these things, that's where we can help each other. In the Netherlands, the government has published a large DPA for the Microsoft 365 cloud environment that is equally relevant to any other organization, public and private, that wants to adopt this type of services. Or for the higher education sector, there is a need to create a working group to basically exchange information and do every assessment once and share the results after for comment and critique, but also for exchanging knowledge. Because otherwise, a lot of human resources, a lot of financial resources are invested to redo the same type of analysis again and again. And apart from that, of course, I see the regulators here in a duty to make such resources for us available to compile on the website all kinds of information that normal people that are working in procurement or in organizations can make informed decisions about whether the contract with a private supplier is actually in line with our legal rules here in Europe. That would be my idea.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for developing that thought. I'm sure we will come back to it a little later. Before we do, let me now go to Matthias Lase to deliver his introductory remarks. If you can, Matthias, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andrzej. I will actually share my screen, if that's all right with you, because I do have a couple slides to visually support my argument. So I think you should now be able to see the slides. And so first of all, let me say thanks a lot for the invitation to speak here today. I believe this year's topic of the forum, which is digital transformation, is a quite important one for a number of reasons. And I will try to engage a bit more closely with one of the reasons, and this is data quality. So data quality has not so far really been on the political radar, I think. But I want to argue that it very much should be. because data matter more than ever in the production of or in the making of European security. And as you're probably aware, institutionalized information exchange on security-related matters in Europe goes back all the way to 1985 with the Schengen Agreement and the resulting Schengen Information System, which went live 10 years later. But this Schengen Information System was in fact just the starting point. Today, we have a quite wide variety of interconnected databases for judicial cooperation, for border control, for law enforcement, for counterterrorism, migration management, and other related issues. And the production of intelligence and resulting interventions are actually largely dependent on the availability and analysis of accurate and reliable data. In practice, however, this is not always so easy. And I would like to tell you two brief stories to illustrate why we should pay attention to data quality. The first story takes place in November of 2015. As you will probably recall, back then a series of coordinated Islamist attacks in Paris and Saint-Denis killed 130 people and injured more than 400. And from a data quality perspective, it is actually quite pertinent what happened in the aftermath of the actual attacks. So a couple hours later, French police stopped one of the attackers, a guy called Salah Abdeslam. And based on his identity, they consulted the Schengen Information System for possible intelligence or alerts on Abdeslam. But as there was no relevant information in the system, he was let go. And only later on did it become clear that the Belgian police indeed had intelligence on Abdeslam's connections to militant Islamism, but they had failed to fully synchronize their national database with the Schengen Information System in time for this information to be available for their French colleagues. And as a result, Abdeslam managed to be on the run for several months. So I think this example shows us quite vividly how operational effectiveness of security can become undercut when security organizations need to operate based on what I would call bad data in air quotes. At the same time, human rights lawyers have over the past years reported numerous cases of persons who were erroneously stopped, questioned, or even detained across Europe based on outdated or inaccurate information in EU Justice and Home Affairs databases. So, for example, the Dutch Ombudsman has detailed a case of a person who held a Dutch residence permit on humanitarian grounds, but was arrested upon trying to enter the EU based on an alert that had been submitted to the Schengen Information System by Italian authorities. And although that alert was illegitimate, and despite multiple requests from Dutch authorities, the alert had not been removed from the system, resulting in the unjustified arrest. And so I think this second case kind of demonstrates to us how bad data can also have human rights implications by directly interfering with the lives of innocent persons. So the question is, what can we learn from these two stories? In the first case, the problem could be described as a lack of timely synchronization between the national level and the EU level. And in the second case, the problem stems from what we might call insufficient stewardship of data, more precisely a lack of communication between national authorities and a resulting lack of updates and corrections. And taken together, I think both cases show us how unreliable data can become a problem for European security, both in terms of operational effectiveness and in terms of the protection of human rights. This then raises the question, what can we do about it? We know from the data science literature that data quality is actually a very complicated issue with lots of different dimensions. It needs to account for different, dimensions such as completeness, accuracy, consistency, timeliness, uniqueness of data. And all these dimensions must also be seen in light of the types of data that we're dealing with. Are we talking about structured data, semi-structured data, unstructured data? Are the data in question raw data? Are they component data, or have they already been processed into information products? How stable are those data? What is their change frequency, and how often do they need to be updated? And moreover, what category of information are we faced with? Are we dealing with biographical data, with biometric data, or with transactional data? Each of them comes with very specific quality challenges. What I'm trying to say here is Data quality is a rather complicated concept, and the problems and potential solution strategies vary actually quite a bit depending on the nature and the context of data. And they are, of course, further complicated if we take into account the architecture of information systems themselves. So what you see here is the two-level architecture of the Schengen information system, with a central system and national systems that are connected to it in every Schengen member state. That means security relevant data are being transmitted to the central system from national databases, where they are then pooled and made available for authorities from each member state. And from a technical point of view, this Schengen information system might be best described as a what the literature calls cooperative information system that interconnects various systems of different and autonomous organizations that share common objectives. So such cooperative systems offer a lot of flexibility, which is required by the institutional design of the Schengen area and also the European area of freedom, security, and justice. But they also result in complex coordination and synchronization needs that can produce additional data quality issues, such as delays or inaccuracies. And I believe the complexity here becomes even more apparent if we scale this up and look at the entire architecture of justice and home affairs databases in Europe today. So this here looks complicated, mostly because it is. So on the right-hand side, you have the 5 European information systems that are explicitly designed for different aspects of border management. These are the new entry access system for digital records of border crossing, the planned European travel information authorization system, the visa information system, the Eurodac fingerprint database, and the European criminal records information system for third country nationals. And on the left, you have the information systems for law enforcement and policing, notably the Schengen information system, but also the Interpol and Europol systems. And as you can see, most of them are set to become interconnected based on the Commission's interoperability initiative that was adopted in 2019. I won't go into detail about all these things here. And there are, of course, also other data sources that are relevant for European security, for example, passenger name record data and other information sources about mobility patterns. But the database architecture that you see here actually provides the lion's share of the intelligence that underpins security interventions in the EU. And the point is, as the number and functions of security-related databases scale up, so do the potential issues caused by bad data. So to stay within the examples discussed earlier, the inaccurate information about an entry ban for a person might also travel to other databases, where it might stay even after eventual correction in the original database. And again, this is about both operational effectiveness and about the protection of human rights. So an improvement of data quality can be seen as a win-win situation that both civil society and security organizations can benefit from. Now, finally, this of course raises the question, who should be responsible for it? As it stands, member states in most cases retain ownership of the data that they submit to European databases. This means they also retain responsibility for data quality, with the exception of some technical issues that are handled by EULISA, which is the European Agency for the Operational Management of Large-Scale IT Systems in the ASFJ. Now, again, the problem here is, and this has been again shown by a survey that has recently been initiated by the Council, that there is actually very little harmonization regarding data quality activities among member states and their competent authorities. Which brings me to 3 possible options how to address this issue from a policy-making standpoint. So first of all, one could argue that data ownership should be transferred to EULISA or another EU body, which would, however, be quite complicated and is rather unlikely to happen due to various practical reasons. So secondly, member states could agree on voluntary guidelines for ensuring data quality in justice and home affairs databases. Or thirdly, and I believe this would be the most promising route forward, member states could agree on mandatory standards and data quality activities for justice and home affairs databases going forward. At the very least, I think awareness for the topic should be raised, and the repercussions of unreliable data in the domain of security should be problematized. I think I'll leave it here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Matthias, thank you for bringing the attention to this very important issue of data quality. My impression is that, at least in the popular discourse, we sometimes seem to believe that whoever, has the access to this data, that that they know everything about us, that there is this kind of godlike visions by the drone operators, and we know that it's not the case, really. And you suggested it by giving the examples, how sometimes perhaps we believe that someone out there knows everything about our every step, and it's not necessarily the case, and there are challenges, both, as you suggested, for the security apparatuses which want to function effectively, and also in terms of human rights. So thank you for bringing the attention to that. I actually have one follow-up question, if I may. I mean, assuming that these security databases are vast and they grow, it must take tremendous brain or computing power to fix them, to keep them to make them in good shape, and to keep them in this good shape. Is it at all possible to do this by humans alone? And when you bring the machines in, doesn't it create other challenges, for review and all that? What's kind of the technical side of the fix to it?
Yes, of course. I think what you brought up here is a very, very pertinent aspect of the actual strategies of how to address data quality. And again, we know from the literature that technical processes or technical kind of strategies, approaches can be very useful, but they have limits, right? So you can use an algorithm to scan for missing values. You can kind of use an algorithm to scan for implausible values in the data, or to kind of flag out suspicious patterns that might hint at kind of modified data, modulated data. But in the end, I think what we know from academic studies is that data quality always needs to be a socio-technical process, right? And if anything, the literature really demonstrates that the organizational commitment to things such as accuracy even during the production of data, accuracy during the transmission of data, active curation processes around data, that these things are, at least as important as the technical aspects, maybe even more important. So I think, the technical stuff is very important here, but the human and the organization around the human remains very much in play. And I think this is something that really can be addressed, from a policy standpoint, but also from the standpoint of security organizations themselves, because as I said, they themselves should have an interest in the improvement of data quality.
Couple of questions from our audience. One by Maria, I will keep for now, because it concerns artificial intelligence, and I think it would be useful to first hear from Edina and then come back to the question. But please, Maria, stay with us. There is one that is related to Matthias's talk and the case that you mentioned, the 2015 Bataclan attacks. And the question is, does the data quality in regards to these attacks had something to do with securitization focused on third country nations? I guess the question is whether there was some kind of racialized perspective inscribed in the way that the security data was evaluated at that time, since the question is on third country nations. So would you be willing to expand on this a little bit?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's a very interesting question, but it's also a very tough one, right? And it's first and foremost a very tough one because we can't really know, and as such, I don't have a direct answer. But what I can say is that certainly, if we look at the evolution of the Schengen information system in specific, going back to 1995 and its first rollout, and then the revision and the rollout of the second generation Schengen system in when was it, 2011, 2013? I'm not sure right now. We see throughout the decades a certain continuous expansion of functionalities, of amounts of data, of different data categories, of access for different law enforcement and other security organizations. And I think one of the major red threads that we see here is the concentration on third country nationals. So the data categories that are being fed into the Schengen information system nowadays have been expanded by many, many things that concern people who are not European citizens. And I think this hints at the discursive connection between border control, migration management, and security, notably counterterrorism. And so I think there might be a certain bias towards third country nationals in terms of being perceived as security risks nowadays. But again, this is something that would need to be, I think, researched in more detail. We know from surveillance studies, we know from human rights lawyers and other academic fields that there are cases again and again where we find discrimination in how someone is represented in a database. From my perspective, the problem is that this is very scattered and very anecdotal. So we can extrapolate from these cases, but to my knowledge, there is no systematic study of how discrimination goes into certain database categories. So I think there is a lot of potential for further research, but I'm actually quite sure that Edina would probably have something to say about that as well.
Okay, let's thank you so much, Matthias, and let's go to Edina. Before I give you the floor, let me just remind whoever may have joined us during this panel in the audience, please, if you have a question or a comment, share it with us in Slido, and I'll be happy to pass it to our panelists. But now, Edina, please.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to this prestigious conference. I'm really happy to be here. I also prepared some slides for you. I'm aware that I have a very short time of 10 minutes to introduce again a new angle to this discussion. I'm going to use some colorful pictures and some big statements maybe that hopefully we can go into more detail afterwards in the talk, or maybe even after the conference. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you see it? Can you confirm, please? Good, excellent. So I'd like to talk about the issue of how big tech and in particularly social media is affecting a democracy around the world, or different political orders. Is it a friend or is it a foe? And as we talked about it previously already, and Tyson Barker was very interestingly closing his presentation saying that there isn't a cybersecurity issue, there is a China and Russia issue and North Korea issue. I'm actually starting my presentation on that note as well, that I think we all became really frightened, and we all realized the political power in the right usage of social media, when we realized that Russia really mingled and had effect on the 2016 election in the US, and then subsequently on the 2020 election. And it looks like they really got hungry on the area. There's evidence that they've been dealing with the Brexit voting and in the Capitol attack on January 6th this year as well. So really what it looks like is that the internet, and specifically social media, became the war zone and the fields for a new Cold War, which I think is not surprising at all. Cold War was played out in different media and different places beforehand. Our most powerful weapon today exactly is information, and trying to convince people about our own correctness and our own beliefs. So what we thought at the beginning, that I think when Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and all this social media came into our life, we thought that bingo, we have this amazing platform for freedom of speech, for freedom of expression. Oppressed people and oppressed groups can talk and organize themselves, and maybe even free some countries and some peoples. And in some cases, they did that in the Arab Spring and some other events. But how did we get here that it actually became a war zone and it became a kind of an open window for enemies as well? I would like to draw the attention that the internet and social media in particular is actually still a very, very useful tool for a lot of oppressed groups, and it's still a very useful tool to give voice for people who otherwise would not have a voice. And I think we often underestimate that, especially if we are in privileged groups and we don't need that extra voice. It helped tremendously to bring out this, century-old idea of Me Too, of abuse and power of abuse. It's helped organize Black Lives Matter, which is one of the most important social activism of our times. And as I mentioned earlier, it brought down dictators. It really helped fuel an amazing movement for freedom with the Arab Spring in 2011. But at the same time, we are really suffering from the consequences of free speech to everyone when we see that it's not just the right kind of people coming in with justful and rightful free speech, but there are people who are bringing in, evil ideas as well and trying to do harm for us on the internet. And unfortunately, we know it from cognitive science and from behavioral sciences that humans orient towards negative news. Fake news is 70% more likely to be retweeted, for example, on Twitter and, of course, on other social media as well. In general, it spreads 6 times faster than the truth. YouTube has this recommendation algorithm that brings us up the videos that's recommending for us. And they themselves claim that 70% of the viewing time on their platform today is actually recommended by their machine. Now, if this algorithm is not overseen properly, which I believe today is not really, then you can imagine the consequences and anyway, the power of it, of closing the individuals into the same circle they are believing in or they got trapped in. Fake news is being forwarded without being read. So Twitter found this phenomenon that we are forwarding just headlines, not even clicking on the issues and trying to read for ourselves whether it could be good, fake news or real. We're just forwarding. So here comes the note with my presentation as well. Please don't believe me and do your own research in very important questions. But who believes fake news? Unfortunately, all of us, everybody. It's very, very difficult very often to distinguish who's lying and who's not, right? And our brain is wired in a way that novelty has always been more engaging and more exciting. Surprise and shock and negative news is always exciting. And we also always, because we're social creatures, seeking social approval from our peers, from our friends, from our neighbors. So we tend to share this. And if you remember back, Facebook really started to thrive and flourish when they introduced the like buttons, and all those, then later on the emojis helped a lot as well, because this is how we're trying to connect with the others and how we constantly trying to get that approval. I have to say, if we have a bad life or we're unsatisfied with it, we actually seek it even more. So willing to do more for those likes. And of course, the lesser educated people there are, a lot more they are prone to believe fake news. So is social media empowering or silencing our voices is very often a debate. But I think it's important to keep in mind that nothing is and ever black and white. And it's a very complex and difficult issue, just like democracy itself is. But at the end of the day, let's just be realistic. These are communication platforms. And this is what the founders of these places basically wanted to make them as well. I mean, Zuckerberg's big dream of connecting the whole world and making a lot of people non-isolated and not lonely and keeping connections actually worked. You know, we are a lot more connected with our relatives and our friends from all over the world than we were before. But look at their ages. I put up that picture just to show you and make you, understand and have a bit more empathy that these guys, these young boys that time couldn't have seen the unintended consequences that their platforms became, right? So they had a good intention that very often made way for the evil as well. So there's always unintended consequences. And in the case of Facebook, how it's working right now and how it's backfiring in a lot of areas is obvious. And from the latest whistleblower scandal where Francis Hogan came up with all the documents from Facebook, unfortunately, it is very worrying that the social network is not taking good enough steps to balance this. In my view, everybody should study chess when they are young, and we should all play strategy games more often. Because if these guys would have played those games and could have had the capability to think ahead, maybe they could have put in the controls as well. But now we see these things a lot better. So what can we do? And what are some of the ideas I just want to throw in there could be the way forward? I think it's very important to have better regulation, and we need to take that a lot more seriously. These places have to become like our streets, like our schools, the playgrounds or the workplaces, that we have to protect our citizens and the people of the world. We have police, we have army, we have law to adhere to. We have to see them all very well reflected in these platforms as well. We cannot just expect for-profit organizations to be their own policemen, okay? And just as we wouldn't be abusing someone on the street because of their looks or for their hairstyle, we shouldn't be able to do that online, which is what's happening today and what gives teenage girls, for example, such hard time being out there. At the same time, we need to understand that we need to cooperate a lot more with these technology companies, because they know a lot more than regulators will ever know about technology, and they have the ability, the speed, and right now the profits as well to implement a lot of the changes. YouTube and Google, for example, have been trying to censor themselves for a long time. I've been trying to look into helping humans in many other ways that you wouldn't actually could expect a for-profit organization to do. So, for example, in major countries, major languages, if you look for ways to kill yourself or ways to join a terrorist group, YouTube would bring up results YouTube and Google would bring up results that trying to turn your head around, right? To give you a phone number to call where they can help you with your problem, or to help you to get into groups that will make you aware that terrorism is not okay and that's not the way for you to go. Unfortunately, they don't do that in any small languages. So if you search those same terms in Hungarian, for example, you're not getting any help. This would be very easy to work with and make it compulsory. Twitter is experimenting with a lot of things to try and stop the spread of hate speech and fake news as well. For example, they put in a tool where they forcing people to read the links, and they just don't allow them to retweet it immediately without reading. But then again, it is not compulsory, that it's experimental stages. And let's face it, it's not their interest to do this. And just one more idea. I think we also have to rethink our identity online and who can we be? Is it okay that I can register myself on Facebook or other platforms in 5 different names and 5 different identities? Because this is what brought in all the troll farms, where we see that a huge number of fake accounts are trying to have conversation with us and trying to harm our communities. I think that's something we need to rethink, with the point that Matthias was already mentioning as well, that we need to protect human rights. We need to protect activists. We shouldn't forget that there's no democracy and no free speech in a huge part of this world, where actually the identities of the people have to be protected. I think technology is great. And we most of us probably here on this call think that technology is great and it can really do good for us. But I think what we are using it for and how we're using it really has to be taken a lot more seriously. Thank you very much.
Adina, we still have about 45 minutes left in this panel, and I have several questions here in the Slido, which is great. We hear also from our audience. And you mentioned unintended consequences. My understanding, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is that this past whistleblowing regarding Facebook, for example, I think the problem there is allegations that they at some point of time, not at the beginning, but at some point of time, they knew what was going on, and they didn't deploy sufficient resources to try to mitigate the problem. And there also was this thing that you alluded, I think, with regard to Hungary and suicide search, that what is now being discussed as part of these allegations is a view that I came across, that that relates to the best Facebook that we actually know, in the US and some big West European countries, but the amount of curation and kind of, making Facebook better, the social media better in languages that are peripheral, in regions and countries that are peripheral, is actually at much lower level. And that actually brings me to a question that we received from Maria a while ago. And that relates to artificial intelligence. So not just social media, but I guess it can be related. We know AI bias systems should not be established as they oppress certain groups. And how can we regulate the creation of it? And perhaps this may relate to the fact that I'll be interested to hear from you that these artificial intelligence systems, they may give the impression of being neutral, of treating everyone the same, but they are made by humans. I mean, at least initially, and their preferences, their choices, their views, their norms, their values may be imprinted in operation of these algorithms. So what's your take on it? And please, anyone who wishes to join, please do. And what can be done about it?
Well, the artificial intelligence and discrimination, unfortunately, is a real big problem. And these companies are not dealing with this seriously enough, even though they recognize it. Unfortunately, there's even evidence that they're trying not to deal with it because it's such a big and expensive and complex problem and issue. But there has been various scandals, well-known scandals, that shows that artificial intelligence and machine learning can only work with the data they already have available. And it's always been the case through history that the data is only looking, or there's more data on things that we are dealing with, and there's more data the way we used to live or on our past. And that's not going to allow us to change the future, right? So some of the big scandals, just to remind ourselves, and a lot of you might know this, is the Apple credit card that came out in 2019 that very clearly gave much lower credit allowances for women than for men, even in cases where the particular women had better credit history, etc., etc. It should have been the other way around. And that is because the machines were looking at data and historic data of who's getting what kind of limits, and the machine learned from all the data that men always get much bigger credit limits than women. So just apply that very easily. The same goes for the other famous scandal or famous revelation at Amazon, when Amazon introduced their AI to screen the CVs that people send in who are trying to work for Amazon. And after actually quite a long time only, they realized that the machine was screening out all the women and only put forward the men. Again, because the historic data showed that Amazon was hiring men. So the machine very, very rightfully agreed and learned it. Well, hello, if we want somebody successful, it has to be a man. That's what it always been. So it is very, very dangerous. The same goes actually for postcodes in the US or in the UK, where they decide on whether to give you an insurance or health insurance, or again, credit or mortgages. And if you're living in a particular postcode, that would probably mean you have a certain skin color they just traditionally didn't trust. And unfortunately, they will not trust in the future as well if we keep these systems. And again, here we need regulation and we need human interference in these systems. It can be done. It's absolutely not impossible, but it is a lot of money and needs attention. And we cannot expect the Googles and Facebooks and Amazons to invest into that.
Okay, thank you. I believe Christina, yes, wanted to join in as well.
I think, first of all, that this panel showed a nice palette or spectrum of different issues, from data quality of Matthias, the role of private social media platforms, and my role of the public sector and public institutions to actually do something and to take their responsibility. Now, I would like to actually link what Edina just so eloquently described a little bit back to what we really need, because an over-reliance on technology, on machine learning, artificial intelligence, is not going to solve all these problems we have discussed right now. As Matthias already rightly emphasized, these are socio-technical systems we are dealing with. And in parts, this is a social issue, and we have to also deal with it in a social way. That means that it is humans that are needed. And now I want to actually make a huge pledge for looking and seeing the important role we have here for public scrutiny, for NGOs, civil society, and academics. And this is something that is often a little bit forgotten. If you think about the Volkswagen diesel scandal, it has been researchers at a US university who have been finding the cheating software. Yeah. If you look at the Pegasus spyware scandal, where this little infiltrating software was put on the mobile phones of regime critics, opponents, of activists, of politicians. Yeah, it has been a group of really smart researchers at the Monk School of Governance and Public Affairs in Canada. If you look at so many other discoveries, these are public sector scrutiny work done by NGOs, it's done by academics. And what we are at the moment still lacking in order to actually keep on doing this important work is, on the one hand, we need less secrecy. We need more transparency. We need also the ability to scrutinize algorithms. One of the biggest challenges in doing this kind of work and studying social media, how misinformation, how illegal content spreads, and so on, is that researchers have tough time to actually get to this data in the first place. We would need data from the platform that allows us to do our job, and this is not granted. At the moment, often this data is treated as business secrets, as trade secrets. We are like standing before a sort of a curtain and we cannot see through. And all our efforts that we are sometimes doing to still work with these data are then criminalized, or we are going to be unplugged from the social networks. That has happened to colleagues in the US recently. So frankly, if we want to deal with technology in the future in any meaningful way, we need also the ability to actually engage with the technology, not just long letters of descriptions of what it is doing and privacy notices in terms of service. But what we need is the ability to send data in and see what it does with this data, the ability to pull statistical data, the ability to see how information spreads, the ability to see who pays for political advertising, and so on and so on and so on. So this is a really, really strong pledge to take that serious. And that's why I'm so delighted that the Digital Services Act actually foresees for the very large platforms the possibility to have a duty to give access to researchers that are accredited by the European Commission. And we need more of this, and not just for the very large platforms, because the Pegasus software was not a very large platform. And many other of these troubling developments are not large players. Yeah. So what I want to give you here is our responsibility starts with making the invisible more visible by shedding more light and sunshine on technology, and especially create the technical environment where we as researchers, but also civil society, has actually a chance to check technology and algorithms and preferencing tools and so on.
More transparency. Now there is actually a comment by one of the viewers. So I'm just sorry, Matthias, please. Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
No worries. I just wanted to quickly jump in on something that Edina has mentioned, and this is what she has called human interference. Right. So basically, the idea that there is no automation that can overrule human decision making. And I think that is a very, very important point. And obviously, regulating the private sector is quite different from regulating the public sector. But still, I think this question of automation and how far automation may actually go in replacing the human or making decisions in place of humans is a very important one. And, again, coming back to the academic literature that actually, in the field of human-computer interaction goes back to the 1960s, 1970s, there's a lot of studies that show that, we had this idea originally that by automating basically everything, we could free up resources that humans could then, spend on, more valuable tasks or have more free time or whatever. But more recent research has actually shown that there's limits to what automation can do, and how beneficial it can actually be for organizations. And so, for instance, when it comes to autonomous weapons systems in Geneva at the United Nations, we have all these debates about where to put the human in the system. Should the human be in the loop? Should the human be on the loop? Or should the human be out of the loop? And I think all the sensible discussions are leaning really towards being or having the human at least on the loop. That means a human has to review every automated processing, every automated decision recommendation that comes from an algorithmic system. Check it for plausibility, check it for moral compatibility, and then green light it. And I think a lot of the issues that we are dealing with, and Edina talked about how algorithms kind of review applications and only let these applications through that fall within a certain pattern. These things are really problematic, and they need human review. That is very, very important from my perspective. And I have been researching predictive policing systems in Germany and Switzerland over the past years. And one thing that struck us very much when engaging with the practitioners in the field was that they told us that every decision recommendation produced by pattern recognition, by algorithmic sorting and sifting of large amounts of data, would be reviewed by a human police officer to check for plausibility, to kind of check whether it would actually, make sense to police a certain risk area. And the most pertinent argument for that was always that, as a public agency, the police would need to retain control of how their knowledge is produced and how their interventions come into being, because they need to be accountable and they need to be, transparent to the public to a certain degree. And if they lose that, if they kind of, give that up and completely, transfer knowledge production processes to black boxed algorithmic systems, they cannot be accountable anymore. And so I think that the question of how much automation and how much human control and how much human review we will actually need to build into these systems is a very, very important one when thinking about how to regulate.
Thank you. I have here a few questions that I'll try to kind of cluster together, because in one way or another they concern the relationship between big tech and government. One viewer points out that according on cites the Snowden revelations, that the US multinational digital companies are not free from the government monitoring. And I mean, we have this kind of major concern now in the Western world about Huawei and 5G, and we tend not to see always Huawei as an actor that is completely separate from the Chinese government. So there are these various models out there, I suppose, and anxieties that are related to them. So what would be your take on that? I mean, then there is a question: who should ultimately decide on data collection and usage concerning public security? Should it be the big tech companies? Should we allow them to take those decisions, or to what extent they should be regulated, and to what extent the governments should be stepping in? And can we have different regulations for social media across different regions and their varying influence on democracy in said regions? I guess a lot to ponder about this big question of the relationship and the regulation. I see Adina's hand, and perhaps Christina also, and Matthias, if he wants to join us later, and please do by all means. But first, Adina.
That is the $1 million question that we just heard now, and that is the big issue here, is that not every governments are created equal. So there are good governments and there are bad governments who are trying to look after their own people, and governments who are trying to kill their own people or cause them suffering and steal from them. And I think we have to realize, and I say that from having seen one of these big tech companies from the inside, that these big companies are trying to, trying to protect people, and they're not trying to protect governments. So a lot of the tools that came out from these companies were established in order to help people in oppressed countries or media in countries where there's no media freedom to protect themselves and continue their work. But at the end of the day, it is a very big task to take on. And I think both Google and Facebook and Twitter, they believed and maybe they still believe that they can do a lot of good for the world, and it may often against really bad dictators and trying to oust them out. But it is a huge role, and it's a huge decision, and we cannot rely on them long term. But then who can we rely on? Can we rely on a Taliban as a government? Who would want to do that now today from what we know about the Taliban? And would you want to protect and help the people of Afghanistan, or would you help the government of the Taliban? these are not very light-hearted issues, and I believe that, you know, as time goes on, maybe this will somehow will be more clear through some good discussions. But I'm also worried that a lot of these big authoritarian governments, for example, like China, is actually very, very effectively closing out the American big tech or any big tech or any of the internet actually from their borders that they can do. Smaller countries can do this in a more difficult way. But big countries like China has shown very clearly that they can cut their citizens off from anybody who's trying to do good for their citizens. Thank you.
In addition, if I may, I would like to add that, of course, the Snowden revelations and other revelations about the, let's say, piggybacking of governments for national security purposes to spy on international telecommunications and data flows has been one of the major reasons for our discussion today on digital sovereignty here in the European Union, but also elsewhere. This whole quest for digital sovereignty that we are seeing now emerging quite forcefully at the level of the EU is something that is embodied in the digital interdependencies that we have, especially with US digital service providers and platforms. But it is also something that has been spurred by the two judgments of the Court of Justice in Schrems I and Schrems II that in both times have invalidated a data transfer arrangement between the EU and the US. First, it was the safe harbor, which was never really safe. And after the privacy shield, that didn't shield much. So I think we are now at some sort of a new focus point where different regions and different powers in the world are finding or recalibrating their position. And that is fascinating because the geopolitics have significantly changed. Now that China is a very serious internet actor as well, we see that also the US is starting to get rather sensitive about personal data flows of its own citizens, potential servicemen of the army, potential people from the government. And also now the US is starting to explore tools how it can protect the sovereignty or the privacy of its own citizens. They are using national security as a tool. The EU has been using for quite some time now data protection law in order to regulate the export of personal data. But in fact, in many ways, the EU or the concerns of the EU and of the US and even China are not so far from each other. There is clearly a lack of trust. That lack of trust at the moment in global data flows that manifests in increasingly new legislation and solution to localize data, to require certain export controls and so on. That doesn't need to be necessarily bad, and not everything immediately breaks the internet. We should be also careful here. It is possible to still extract value from data, to make something with the data without that necessarily the data is constantly copied and moved around the world. I am actually thinking that right now we are getting a more, let's say, realistic version also of the US, because now they are looking into like-minded countries. They are trying, as we heard earlier today, to build up the transatlantic trade and technology partnership. The European Union is a very important partner here, and vice versa for the EU. The US is more like-minded than maybe China in its approach. But it also requires especially a mutual respect. This is also why the news last week that the US, there are some initiatives to start a surveillance law reform that also non-US citizens, foreigners such as the Europeans, as I am, would get the same amount of protection against state-induced surveillance as US persons. So there's still a lot of work. We are having clearly different constitutional traditions, different legal traditions. In the US, free speech has been always attributed a higher value than data protection and privacy, whereas in the European Union, exactly data protection and privacy receives a lot of attention from policymakers, decision makers. Whereas this is something that US companies are building, all these data-driven business models that are actually there to harness as much personal data as possible and exploit them. So what we need is to hammer out alignment here and there. Everybody has to give in, especially the US should not expect that they can surveillance the entire internet except of US persons. And here we have a chance to think in terms of like-minded nations. So it's important to keep this dialogue. And at the same time, it is important that the European Union is carefully scrutinizing its digital sovereignty ambitions. And it is not just about being autonomous in the protection of certain critical technologies like semiconductor chips that we have heard this morning. Digital sovereignty also implies that we are not, that we are able to actually guarantee fundamental rights that we have here in Europe, also when citizens are using foreign-born services. This is going to become very important. And that brings us also back to artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence is a rather diffuse technology that can be supplied across borders. And what we don't want is that we have inbound artificial intelligence solutions, like, for example, the Clearview AI facial recognition system that has been collected against the rules here in Europe and then be deployed all over the world by law enforcement authorities, including in Europe. Although the way how this facial image database has been created and the AI has been trained has not been in line with the law. We have to be much more smart to see that these technologies are, of course, totally ignorant about borders and geographically independent, but that we need equally liquid regulatory solutions to ensure that once they are deployed inside the European Union, for example, that we can ensure that they are also compliant with our local laws and fundamental rights.
Thank you for that. Please, Matthias.
Yeah, first of all, let me say that I wholeheartedly agree with what both Christina and Edina have said, and I can only underline the importance of, kind of forging global alliances here. But I did actually want to engage with the first part of the question, which, if I recall correctly, was about the role of private companies in the making of security. And I think this is actually a very interesting and also very dynamic area that has not really been settled so far. And to illustrate what I mean is you probably recall the story about the conflict between Apple and the FBI a couple of years ago, right? So the FBI had a case in which they investigated, and the suspect had a phone, and they wanted to access the phone, and the suspect, of course, didn't want to grant the FBI access to their phone. The phone was encrypted, and so the FBI tried to break the encryption, which they couldn't do because it was a very strong encryption. And so they approached Apple and asked them whether they would be of assistance in a criminal proceeding, and Apple declined, citing reasons of customer protection, privacy protection. And this case, I think, is very illustrative of the dilemma that private companies are facing, because on the one hand, they kind of have the obligation to contribute to national security, international security, but on the other hand, they have a business case by saying, look, we need to protect our customers, because if we can't protect our customers, then this is a serious blow to our projects or to our products. I'm sorry. And so I think what this really illustrates is the kind of very strange situation where private companies like Apple all of a sudden come across as the protectors of privacy or intimacy, but just for the morally wrong reasons, because it's a business case that they build around. And I think also the Snowden revelations, and Christina just talked about that before, the Snowden revelations show us pretty clearly how the CIA and in extension the Five Eyes networks globally have been using data from private companies such as Amazon, such as Google, Facebook, and others. I think it is still not really clear whether the data from these companies have been provided to the CIA on a voluntary basis, or whether these companies have been kind of forced into giving up their data. Be that as it may, I think relying on private company data for security purposes is a very interesting kind of backdoor solution for intelligence services to doing what they are legally forbidden to do. And this is, in that specific case, looking at data that is, specifically from US citizens. So, they kind of found a really, convenient workaround to do away with their own legal roadblocks in doing their work and doing what they perceived as necessary. So we're seeing the emergence of a completely new type of constellation that Bruce Schneier has called public-private surveillance partnership, right? So he kind of starts with the idea that we have public-private collaboration in many areas, in many kind of policy domains. But in the security sphere, when it comes to intelligence services and their work, there might be a completely new type of public-private partnership, which incorporates the private sector. And I think we still have to figure out what exactly the role of the private sector here is, and how we can, from a policy perspective, intervene into that new type of collaboration.
Thank you very much. I have two questions left.
Can I add just one?
Yes, please, Adina, of course.
Just quick. One is that I also like to remind everyone on the difficult decision that Twitter brought at the beginning of this year, where they actually banned Donald Trump from their platform. Again, actually, it wasn't even the decision of the CEO. It was the decision of the public policy and legal leader of Twitter. So there's just tremendous stress and tremendous decisions on these private companies and actually those individuals working at those companies that is very, very difficult to handle. And the other thing I also wanted to point out that not all these tech companies are the same. They not run on the same ethical principles. Their owners and their founders are different type of people and characters. As well, I know for facts that whilst I was working for Google was not working with, for example, with the Hungarian government under any circumstances. That was not to be allowed, or with the case, and that was the situation. That was the take for every government. But I also know that there were other companies, tech companies, who were happy to have stronger alliances with governments around the world. And again, that's an individual decision of those companies. So let's just make sure that we cannot treat all of them under the same umbrella, just like as we saw with Apple, again, bringing that very controversial decision in order to show its integrity to the world.
To what you have just said, I think, but also something that we discussed a little bit earlier, but still I think it's useful to develop perhaps the discussion further. Bahruz is asking, activists in my country, Azerbaijan, face harassment, profile hacking on Facebook, and the administration, probably meaning Facebook administration, is usually very slow in taking action. So how to address it? I mean, there is now an expectation that these social media companies should somehow be involved in mitigating or preventing, human trafficking, sexual harassment, hate speech. But what about these cases when it's not a government necessarily, a government against an individual, but the government actually uses proxies, which I think is what's happening here, to harass someone for being a human rights defender or having certain political views in these settings. So what would be your view on that?
Yeah, so this is exactly the case, that the dilemma that I was talking about, that again, you can't treat every country and any government the same way. And I don't know how we're going to solve this issue, and I don't know how Facebook or any other company is going to solve this issue, and also whether how long they're going to invest into that and deal with this. In my opinion, they don't invest enough into people who could be hired in their companies to deal with the individual cases and with the different governments, because some of these issues would be at the end of the day, quite easy decision, but someone needs to deal with it, at least. But really, as I said, we can't expect them just out of our, strong will that they're going to do that. We have to cooperate with them, and we have to come up with some rules, at least across the EU, at least with America, that applies to all of these companies, and then we have to enforce that all together with them. The other note I wanted to say, just that when I joined Google in 2010, the first event I went to was a quite an amazing event that Google organized for activists around the world. And it was a partially secretive conference, I shall say, where Google paid for activists from Iran, from Thailand, from the Philippines, and parts of Africa, who were well-known activists, basically working against their own regimes. And I was truly amazed by that effort that a company like Google invests into to have those people travel. The conference was in Budapest, and they trained these people on cybersecurity and on how to defend themselves online and how to block themselves online. And it was fascinating topics. And I don't know if anybody's doing that anymore. But I'm assuming there should be some NGOs, some civil societies, some engineers who work for good, who should be helping these activists. But I'm not aware of those things today. But I know that Google has been working with that, and I know that Facebook has similar efforts as well.
Thank you, Katarina, please.
I think, the record is mixed, and if I understand the viewer who has asked the question to us as a panel, then I have to say, yes, it's true. If you are not able to reach any customer service to fix your profile on Facebook that has been allegedly hijacked, then this is a problem, because this is something we hear more often about these hyperscalers, that it is almost impossible to actually reach somebody to help, especially when it is urgent and necessary. And that makes Facebook somehow a bit a faceless company. If you are very big, then also the responsibility is big, and this goes hand in hand. And at the same time, I also would like to say, yes, we cannot and we should not look to the largest tech companies of the world to help us with our social problems. It is something that we as societies and the public sector, and also as an active citizenship, we have to do ourselves. I find it rather, let's say, counterproductive and alarming if everything becomes Google-ficated. Yeah, I of course welcome any initiatives to educate and help, but at the same time we are increasingly having issues that there is Google is everywhere, and many of our sectors of society are actually to such an extent dependent. Think of Google News Initiative or similar things on particular one company, that we should wonder if this is still a healthy degree of influence. Yeah. So having said that, I think we as Europeans, but also any other society in this world, should actually emancipate itself and not hang on the drop of technical aid, and instead also require to learn and to develop this knowledge in order to be part of these digital developments, instead of just being a consumer, a taker, a dependent power. Okay.
Thank you, and I apologize, Christina, of course. Yes, we are nearing the end, but let me then ask a question which is sort of inspired by one that I got in here, but follows immediately on what you said. Now, the EU has a fairly ambitious digital agenda, and it has a certain clout in this data politics, and it can be expected that if this all goes through, that certain norms will be developed, which will also kind of be projected outside the EU, because there will be certain partnerships, and it's a big market. Do you think that there is a chance that the EU, will be thinking about this, or will be simply be promoting sort of EU-centric perspectives on dealing with all those challenges, all those issues that we mentioned, but in view of the norms that the EU might not only develop, but successfully project elsewhere, it would try to also see these issues from the other's perspective, so to say. So, Christina?
I think it's a very, very good that the European Union is taking such an emancipated position today in developing various legal initiatives, starting from the European Data Act, the European Data Governance Act, the European AI Act, the Digital Service Act, the Digital Markets Act, and so on. Yeah, these are a lot of initiatives that are trying to address many important questions. But there are two things that worry me a little bit. One is that it is a lot of initiatives, and that, as we know, policymaking also needs a bit of time to be implemented and to engender acceptance and commitment on those that are actually at the receiving end of these policies, and that we are actually at the moment seeing how our General Data Protection Regulation, which is one of the strongest instruments in the world, is actually not applied and enforced the way as it ought to be. So we are creating new legislation that is trying to mitigate some of these massive digital risks we are dealing with. And when I read these legal texts, then there are two issues that make me worried. Again, it is becoming very, very complex, a long, complicated regulatory logic with many requirements when you want to apply a certain article from this new regulation, that makes it intrinsically vulnerable to actually being less applied or not applied later. And it would sometimes help to really strengthen the basic tenets of digital regulation, and that is actually accountability, liability, and transparency. these three things, if we get them right across the board, will actually bring us further as extremely complicated rules that apply to a few under certain requirements and so on. So I actually would say it is good that the European Union is doing that. I also think it benefits other countries because it is something that is also in their own interest. I mean, they will be, on the one hand, they will be able to see that it can be done. On the other hand, they will be able to also protect fundamental rights, consumer rights, and other important interests like non-discrimination in their own constituency. And yes, there are always other countries, like Edina rightly said, governments are not all created equal, yeah, that will use exactly the same regulatory logic in order to create something that is control, authoritarianship, and so on. But we cannot stop like trying to do good regulation just because they are the Russia and China and other countries actually that are abusing this type of regulatory initiatives for a totally different end. So I believe the European Union is going the right way, but I would strongly alert them to keep it simple, make rules intuitive. And of course, we also see that there's a lot of lobbying now going on in Brussels right now that is trying to influence this policy-making process. And here, what I have to say is there are different lobbying strategies, and one of them is make the rules impossible to apply. I mean, it's not just about lobbying them away, but making them so impossible, complicated, full of difficult juridical questions, then you will in the end not have much value from it.
Thank you so much. Yes, Matthias, please.
Yeah, maybe just as a final comment, I think equally important as enforceability is actually public awareness. You know, if people do not know about their legal instruments to address some of the issues that they might be facing, you know, be it the right to redress or the right to be forgotten, these kinds of, you know, very, very good and very, I would say also successful initiatives, they don't get traction if we don't, you know, have the public aware and in a position to use these tools. So I think, of course, they need to be enforceable, but they also need to be widely known. And I think this is really, really key in bringing regulation to life.
Thank you. Edina, any last words?
Thank you very much for being here. I think we only managed to show, as far as I understand, how complex this issue is. And how much more information I think we all need, and how much more collaboration we need. I think for me it was very striking that the EU couldn't even coordinate, regulations around travel on the COVID or vaccination in this very, very, very important topic. So I'm really worried sometimes how we're going to be able to protect ourselves in the cyberspace if we can't even agree on, you know, entry requirements in the time of pandemics. But I truly believe in the EU, and I truly believe that we need a lot more cooperation, and then we would be able to, and more education and understanding of what actually is happening, and then we can create a much safer environment for our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all. It's my little hope that, you know, discussions such as this one may advance us a little bit, at least, toward that end game. And when we went really across the board, we covered a lot of issues. I'm sure it was really interesting for our viewers, our audience. So, thanks to all of you who took your time to speak here today. Thanks also to all of you in the audience. And this concludes our first panel at Schengen Security Forum. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
See you soon. Bye-bye.